The first time Sira Voss saw the Alpha King, she didn't know he was a king. She didn't know he was watching her either. She was too busy squinting at the beverage dispenser in the embassy's waiting hall, trying to figure out which symbol meant coffee, and which meant something that would probably dissolve the lining of her stomach. The machine was Vrethian design, all curved ideographs and pressure-sensitive panels that responded to biochemical signatures she didn't have. She pressed 3 buttons in sequence, received a cup of something pale green, sniffed it, and set it down on the nearest surface. "Not what you wanted," said a voice. She turned. A man, no, not a man, but close enough that her brain defaulted, stood near the far archway, tall. Dark-haired in the way that suggested it absorbed light rather than reflected it. His eyes were the color of deep water over volcanic rock, and they were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual, because Sira Voss was very good at reading expressions. "No," she said, "I wanted coffee." The 4th symbol from the left on the lower tier. "Thank you." She went back to the machine, found the symbol, pressed it, received something dark and scalding that smelled like home. When she turned again, the archway was empty. She didn't think about him again until the negotiations began. The Vreth sovereignty had been in contact with Earth for 11 years. Diplomatic, they called it. Careful was what the briefing said, which in diplomatic language meant, "We are being evaluated and so far we are failing." The sovereignty was the 3rd largest political entity in the Orion Arm, a confederation of 22 species under a governance structure so layered and ritualized that Earth's entire foreign affairs division had spent 6 years just mapping the protocol hierarchy. At the top of that hierarchy sat the Alpha Council, 12 regional kings whose authority over their territories was absolute, whose decisions shaped trade routes, resource access, and war. Sira was not a diplomat. She was a cognitive linguist attached to the Earth Embassy as a cultural linguistic consultant, which meant her actual job was to watch the aliens watching the humans and figure out what they were actually thinking. She had a desk in a room with no windows, access to every recorded exchange between Earth representatives and sovereignty officials for the past decade, and a gift, her words, though not immodest. It was simply true for pattern recognition. What she had noticed over those recorded exchanges was this: the sovereignty was not evaluating Earth's technology. They had better. They were not evaluating Earth's resources. They had more. They were evaluating something else entirely, and nobody in the diplomatic corps had been able to name it. Sira had a theory. She hadn't shared it yet. The negotiations were supposed to be routine, trade access to a particular transit corridor that would shave 3 weeks off Earth's supply runs to the outer colonies. The sovereignty had agreed in principle. This meeting was about finalization. Sira's job was to sit behind the glass in the observation room, watch the body language, and flag anything that read wrong. What she saw, when the sovereignty delegation filed in, was the man from the waiting hall. He sat at the head of the table. She looked at the identification overlay on her tablet. Kale Drevenathas, Alpha King of the Vreth Sovereignty's 7th Dominion, which was, her notes told her, the largest single territory in the sovereignty, a stretch of 17 systems with an economy larger than Earth's entire GDP. He had held the position for 40 years, which was young by Vrethian standards. He had never lost a negotiation. He had ended 2 wars by simply arriving on the contested border and waiting. Sira looked at the 4th symbol from the left on the lower tier of her memory and thought, huh. She watched him for 3 hours. He didn't move much. He spoke rarely, and when he did, the room shifted, not metaphorically but actually. The other sovereignty officials changed their posture, their eye contact, their vocal register. He carried what she could only describe as gravity. Everything in the room oriented toward him, whether it meant to or not. She wrote in her notes, "Does not perform authority. It simply exists in him. Earth negotiators will misread stillness as disengagement. It is not. He is processing everything. She wrote, his eyes move differently when Ambassador Calloway speaks versus when Second Chair Rains speaks. More attention to Rains. Why? Rains is junior. Calloway has all the formal authority, unless formal authority is not what he is tracking. She wrote, he looks at the observation glass twice. He cannot see through it. The panel is reflective from his side. He knows someone is watching anyway. She underlined that last one. The corridor exchange was finalized, which surprised everyone. Earth had been prepared for 2 more sessions. The sovereignty moved fast when it decided to move, apparently, and it had decided. Sierra's supervisor, a brisk woman named Director Chen, clapped twice and called it a win. Sierra went back to her notes and sat with the unease that had taken up residence somewhere behind her sternum. The sovereignty had given Earth something it wanted with unusual ease. In her experience, limited compared to the lifers, but she trusted it. People did not give you things easily unless they wanted something in return, or unless they had already decided you were not a threat and therefore could afford generosity, or unless the thing they gave you was not, in fact, what mattered. She pulled 10 years of sovereignty behavioral records. She cross-referenced them with the outcome patterns of every trade negotiation the sovereignty had concluded in that period. She built a map of what they had conceded, when, and to whom. The pattern was clear once you were looking for it. The sovereignty did not negotiate. The sovereignty tested. Every concession was a probe. Give a small thing. Watch what the recipient does with it, what they ask for next, how they behave when they think they have won. The negotiations were not the point. The negotiations were the diagnostic tool. Earth had been in the diagnostic phase for 11 years. Sierra wrote a report. She submitted it at 11:47 p.m. to Director Chen's secure queue. She went home to her quarters in the embassy residential wing, made actual coffee from the actual bag she'd brought from home, and sat by the window looking out at the alien skyline of Vreth Prime. All curved towers and bioluminescent transit lines, beautiful in a way that felt like a held breath. Her tablet chimed. Director Chen, come to my office, now. You're telling me, Director Chen said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone not angry yet but approaching it rapidly, that we have spent 11 years being evaluated, and we have been passing the test, and the thing we did today, accepting the corridor deal this quickly, might be seen as *greedy. Not greedy, Sierra said. Unsophisticated. The sovereignty's pattern shows they expect a slow dance. Request, counter, withdraw, return. They interpret a quick acceptance as either desperation or a failure to understand the value of what you've been given. Both readings make Earth look like a poor long-term partner. The ambassador is going to love this. The ambassador doesn't have to know it came from me. Chen looked at her for a long moment. What do you recommend? Find a way to reopen the conversation. Not to change the deal is fine, but to demonstrate that Earth isn't simply taking what's offered, that we understand value, that we negotiate from competence, not need. And how do we do that without looking like we're moving goalposts, which is its own problem? Sierra had been thinking about this since the observation room. You give them something they didn't ask for, something small but precise, something that shows you understood what asterisk they wanted from the exchange, not just what you wanted. It signals that Earth pays attention. And what do the sovereignty want from this exchange? Sierra thought about the man who had watched the observation glass even though he couldn't see through it. I think, she said carefully, they want to know if we're worth trusting. Specifically, if we're worth trusting to be honest about what we don't know. Chen frowned. That's an unusual metric. I think they're unusual people. The next morning, Sierra submitted a formal request to join the follow-up session as an active participant rather than an observer. She expected it to be denied. It was not. Ambassador Calloway, either out of curiosity or because Director Chen had said something, added her name to the delegation roster. The follow-up session was smaller, 4 from Earth, 3 from the Sovereignty. Kale Drevenathas was not among the 3. Sierra noted this and tried to decide if it was significant, decided probably not, and sat in her chair and paid attention. The Sovereignty's second chair, a Vrethian named Assessor Vel, was running the session. He was thorough and precise, and had the affect of someone who had prepared extremely carefully and intended to demonstrate it. Sierra watched him deliver a summary of the corridor agreement's technical terms and thought, he is performing competence for an audience that isn't here. She found that interesting. When Vel finished, there was a pause. Calloway began to respond. Sierra cleared her throat. Calloway looked at her. She said, quietly enough that only the Earth side could hear, "Could I have a moment?" Calloway, to his credit, gave it to her. Sierra looked at Vel and said, impassable Vrethian. She had been studying for 8 months. Her accent was imperfect. Her vocabulary was sufficient. "I want to ask something that may reflect poorly on my preparation. If I am wrong to ask, I apologize. But I have been reviewing the terms and I don't understand the third provision scope clause. I believe we may be interpreting it differently." The room shifted. Vel's posture changed. Not alarmed, more alert, he leaned forward slightly. He said in perfect standard, "Explain the discrepancy as you understand it." She did. She was right about the interpretation gap. She'd found it at 2 a.m. and spent an hour verifying it. The clause as written left a boundary ambiguity that Earth's lawyers had read one way, and the Sovereignty almost certainly intended another. Not malicious, just the predictable gap of 2 legal systems built on entirely different axioms. It could have caused a serious problem 6 months down the line. "This is a valid concern," Vel said. When he said it, something in his face changed that she would later spend a long time trying to describe. She settled on, as if something he had expected to happen had finally happened, and he was not displeased. They spent 2 hours clarifying the provision. The session ran long. Nobody complained. Calloway, to Sierra's private admiration, rolled with it gracefully. Afterward, when the Sovereignty delegation had filed out, he looked at her and said, "I'm not sure if I should thank you or be furious that you just derailed my clean exit." "The exit wasn't as clean as we thought," she said. "No," he agreed, "apparently not." A pause. "Good catch, Voss." She gathered her things and tried to ignore the feeling that she had just, very deliberately, stepped into something much larger than a transit corridor. The reception that evening was standard embassy circuit, a thing that happened after any formal session, an opportunity for informal exchange that both sides used to gather intelligence about the other while pretending to enjoy miniature food. Sierra went because she was on the official delegation now, and attendance was expected. She wore the only dress she'd brought that was appropriate for the occasion, secured her hair, and spent 20 minutes rehearsing conversational openers in Vrethian before concluding she was going to have to rely on standard and her face. She was standing near the window with a glass of something she'd verified in advance was safe for human consumption, a pale gold drink that tasted like pears and something slightly electric, talking to one of the younger Sovereignty aides, a Vrethian named Castle who had cornered her with enthusiasm about Earth music. "The thing I don't understand," Castle was saying, "is how you generate pitch variation through breath alone. Our vocal structures are different, we use resonance chambers, but the range your species achieves with such a simple mechanism is..." "Honestly same," Sierra said. "I took a physiology class once that explained it and I still don't entirely believe it works." She smiled. Castle was genuinely charming, with an open face and the slightly too intense focus of someone who found everything interesting. He was also, she noticed, extremely attractive in the way of a species that had apparently decided cheekbones were non-negotiable. She said, because she was thinking it and she was not at diplomatic events enough to have learned the habit of not saying what she was thinking. Also, you are very good looking, which I realize is an unusual thing to say to a colleague, but I have had 2 of these drinks and I stand by it. Castle blinked. He laughed, a surprised, genuine sound. I don't. That is not a category of observation I typically receive. Well, you should. It's relevant data. You are very direct. I'm a linguist. We use words for things. The temperature in the room changed. It was subtle. Sierra noticed it the way she noticed everything, a fraction after it happened, processed, filed. The light hadn't changed. The sound level hadn't changed. But something in the ambient quality of the space had shifted, like a pressure drop before weather. She turned. Kale Drevanathis stood 12 feet away, holding a glass he had apparently stopped drinking from. He was looking at her. His expression was what she had come to think of as his default, still, unreadable, entirely present. But there was something in it that she hadn't seen before, something very controlled that wanted not to be. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he looked at Castle. Then, with deliberate smoothness, he looked away. Sierra looked at Castle. Castle had gone very still. Is he your, she started. My liege, Castle said very quietly. The Alpha King of the 7th Dominion. Right, Sierra said. I know who he is. She paused. Is there a protocol I just violated? Castle's expression was difficult to read. He said, carefully, not precisely, but you should know that. He stopped. He seemed to be weighing something. Alpha Kings do not typically appear at receptions they do not host. Sierra looked at the room. The sovereignty officials she could identify were all, now that she looked, arranged in a pattern that radiated outward from Kale's position. Not obviously, but unmistakably if you were looking for it. He came for a reason, she said. They always do, Castle said. She thought about it on the walk back to her quarters. She thought about it while she made coffee and sat at her small desk with her notes. She thought about the way the room had oriented toward him without meaning to, and the way he had looked at her when she said something casually appreciative about another man's face, and the way that look had been. She stopped that thought. She was a professional. She wrote in her notes instead, the Alpha King attended a reception he did not host. This is apparently anomalous. Why? She didn't have an answer. She wrote, he noticed me at the reception in a way that felt different from the observation room. In the observation room it was neutral. I was a variable he was tracking. Tonight it was. She stopped again. She crossed out it was and wrote, inconclusive, insufficient data. She went to bed. She dreamed about non-linear time, a feeling she recognized from a philosophy seminar she'd attended years ago, the instructor talking about trauma as a thing that created ripples, each one moving outward in all directions simultaneously, backward as much as forward. She woke up with the dream still in her teeth and the feeling that she had missed something. The next 3 days were filled with the secondary sessions that followed any major negotiation, working groups, technical briefings, cultural exchange programming that the embassy staff organized with the weary professionalism of people who had run the same itinerary 17 times. Sierra sat in on 2 sessions, contributed to 1, and spent the rest of her time in the archives pulling records. What she found, the more she looked, was a pattern around the Alpha King specifically. In every major diplomatic exchange the 7th Dominion had engaged in over the past 2 decades, there was a moment, often a small one, where a human representative had done something instinctive rather than protocol correct, admitted uncertainty, laughed unexpectedly, expressed something spontaneous and unscripted, and in every case the outcome had shifted, not always immediately, but the relationship after that moment was different from the relationship before it. Earth's team had done this too, occasionally without knowing it. The corridor deal that had started all of this, she traced it back. 2 years ago, at a preliminary session, A junior Earth attaché named Park had apparently dropped a data tablet in the middle of a formal presentation, watched it skitter across the floor, and said to the sovereignty observer, "Well, that was professionally devastating." And the sovereignty observer, she checked who it was, had been Assessor Vel. She found Vel's behavioral record from that session. Marked, favorable reassessment of Earth delegation following informal exchange. She sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote a memo that she addressed not to Director Chen but to Ambassador Calloway, marked it personal and confidential, and titled it, "On the Vrethian Concept of Authentic Imperfection as a Trust Signal." It took her 4 hours to write. It was the best thing she had ever written. She sent it at 3 a.m. and then sat by her window looking at the bioluminescent transit lines until her coffee went cold. Calloway asked to see her at 8 a.m. When she walked into his office, he looked like a man who had read something that rearranged his furniture. He had her memo open on his screen. "This," he said, "is either going to make my career or end it." "I'm fairly confident it's the former," she said. "How long have you been working on this?" "The pattern about 8 months. The specific articulation, 4 hours last night." He looked at her. "You've been sitting on this analysis for 8 months. "I was checking it," she said. "I didn't want to be wrong." "And you're not wrong." "I'm not wrong." He leaned back. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quality of that quiet. It was the quiet of someone recalibrating their entire map. "So what you're telling me," he said slowly, "is that the most effective diplomatic tool we have with the Vreth sovereignty is not better legal language or stronger resource packages. It's being genuinely, demonstrably, unscriptably human." "Yes. And we've been failing at that by trying too hard to be what we thought they respected. We've been trying to be legible to their framework. And their framework respects control, precision, hierarchy. But what they asterisk trust is something different. What they trust is," she searched for the word, "authenticity, the evidence that you are not performing, because a species that can perform flawlessly, that's a species that can deceive flawlessly. The sovereignty has met species like that. The relationships ended badly." Calloway was quiet again. Then, "And the Alpha King, is he the one running this evaluation?" Sierra had been waiting for this question. She had been deciding since 3 a.m. how to answer it. "I think," she said, "the Alpha King has been running it since before any of us were here. I think this is something very personal to him, not just policy." Calloway frowned. "Personal how?" "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm going to find out." She didn't expect to find out the way she did. There was a cultural exchange event that afternoon. One of the itinerary items, a demonstration of Vrethian arts in one of the embassy's larger halls. Sierra went because she went to everything, and because she was finding, increasingly, that her theory needed contact with the man himself to solidify or collapse. The hall was arranged with several installations, each one attended by a Vrethian artist or representative willing to explain it. One of them was a kind of music, not music exactly, more like structured sound that operated on frequencies human ears caught only partially, the audible portion emerging and submerging like something moving under dark water. It was unsettling in a way that made Sierra want to stay near it. She was standing at the edge of this installation, listening with her eyes half closed, when someone stopped beside her. "You hear it differently than the others," Kale Drevenathas said. She opened her eyes. He was standing closer than she'd expected, looking at the installation rather than at her. Up close, the gravity she'd noticed across rooms was more precisely itself. It wasn't performed or constructed. It was simply a property of him, the way some places had different air. "I'm probably missing half of it," she said. "Human hearing range is pretty limited." "The half you hear," he said, "you listen to completely. Most humans in this room are politely present. You are actually listening." She thought about that. That's a very kind observation. It is an accurate one. He paused. You also submitted a document to your ambassador this morning that demonstrates a more complete understanding of sovereignty cultural frameworks than anything in your government's diplomatic records to date. She looked at him. You have access to internal embassy memos. The embassy's secure communications are not as secure as your team believes, he said, with what she thought might be a very small, very dry thing that was almost humor. This is not an espionage admission. It is a recommendation that you flag it to your technical staff. I will, she said. And then, because she was, as she had told Castle, a person who used words for things, can I ask you something directly? You may. What have you been looking for? For 11 years, what has the evaluation been looking for specifically? He turned and looked at her then fully, the way he had looked at the observation glass in the negotiation room, as if the glass weren't there. Evidence, he said, that your species can be known. She waited. There are species in this galaxy, he said, that are coherent. What they show you is what they are. Their documentation matches their behavior. Their stated values and their practiced values are the same system. They are reliable because they are legible. A pause. There are other species that are not coherent. They show you what serves them. Their documentation is constructed for your reading. Their stated values are a different operating system from the one actually running. And you can't tell which category we're in, Sira said. We could not, he said, until recently. She thought about the corridor deal, the provision she'd flagged, the young attaché's dropped tablet from 2 years ago, the decades of small, unscripted moments that had apparently been weighed and accumulated. What changed? She asked. He looked at her. The answer was in his eyes before he said it, and she understood it before he found the words for it, and something in her chest contracted in a way she had no professional framework for. 3 days ago, he said, someone at a reception said something true that served no strategic purpose and had no calculated effect. She simply said it because it was accurate. Sira thought about Castle, about the 2 drinks, about saying you are very good looking, which I realize is an unusual thing to say to a colleague. That was not, she said carefully, a demonstration of diplomacy. No, he said, that was the point. The silence between them was the kind that had weight. She had studied communication for 12 years. She had cataloged silences the way other people cataloged words, the silence that meant refusal, the silence that meant consideration, the silence that meant something had been said that needed to settle before the conversation could continue. This was that last kind, and it went on long enough that she became aware of the installation sound again, its unresolvable frequencies, and it seemed suddenly appropriate. You came to the reception, she said. Castle said that was unusual. It was. Why? He was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet, not processing, not weighing, but something more like the pause before you say a thing you have decided to say. Because I had read your preliminary reports, he said. And I wanted to understand how someone writes with that degree of clarity, and then cannot work the embassy beverage dispenser. She laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to allow it. He looked at her when she laughed, and the expression on his face was one she didn't have a name for. It was not what she'd seen there before. It was something that had been kept somewhere else and had briefly gotten out. In my defense, she said, the symbols are completely non-intuitive. The lower-tier symbols are arranged by temperature, not beverage type. That is information that would have been useful 3 days ago. Yes, he said. I know. And he said it in a way that made it clear he had known, that he had watched her set down the green drink and had said nothing and then said, the 4th symbol from the left on the lower tier, that he had given her just enough, just the one thing, and watched what she did with it. She thought about the sovereignty's pattern again, the testing, the probing, give a small thing, watch what the recipient does with it. You've been running the evaluation personally, she said. Not as policy, personally. He inclined his head slightly. Why personally? Because, he said, and something shifted in his face that she had learned in 3 days was the Vrethian equivalent of a flinch. I made the recommendation that the sovereignty engage with Earth 18 years ago. The evaluation is my responsibility. The outcome of it, a pause. It matters to me. Why? He looked at her with those deep-water eyes and said, very quietly, because I have spent 40 years reading species. And 18 years ago, I read something in your early transmissions, your literature, your history, your arguments, your failures, and what you did with them, that made me believe that humanity was something the galaxy had not yet encountered, something that could not be easily categorized, something that might be worth the risk. The risk of what? Of trusting, he said, which is the most dangerous thing any intelligent species can do. Sierra stood very still. She thought about her report at 3 a.m., about the transit lines outside her window, about the feeling that she had stepped into something larger than a corridor deal. She thought about the way 11 years of evaluation suddenly resolved, in her mind, into a single image. A man who had read the transmissions of a species and decided, against policy, against precedent, against his own careful nature, to believe in them before he had evidence, and who had then spent almost 2 decades patiently building that evidence so that he could justify the belief he'd already chosen. She thought about the film she'd watched once, in a philosophy seminar, about nonlinear time, about how the present always contains the future and the past at once, and how sometimes you recognize a thing not when it happens, but when you understand that it was already there. You believed in us before you knew us, she said. Yes. That's very human of you, she said. He looked startled. It was the most expression she had seen on his face, and it was gone in a moment, but she caught it. I am not, he said, human. No, but that's a very human thing to do. Decide first, justify after. Lead with the feeling and build the argument around it. She paused. We do it all the time. Most of our best decisions work that way. He was looking at her with the quality of attention she'd noticed in the negotiation room, total, without remainder. He said slowly, as if testing the statement against something internal, the most powerful force in this galaxy is not technological or military. The sovereignty's research has supported this conclusion for longer than I have been Alpha King. The most powerful force is, he stopped. Consciousness, she said, and what it decides to be true. He looked at her. Interconnection, she said, the totality of it. The fact that things touch each other across distances that shouldn't allow contact. She was thinking of her dream of ripples in time, of trauma and its backward reach, but she was also thinking of something less abstract. The fact that someone can read your transmissions from across the galaxy and decide you're worth trusting. That's not military or technological. That's just, she searched, being known across the distance. He was very still. She had the sense of something enormous, something that had been held in perfect controlled suspension for a very long time, not moving but not settled, being recognized. Your report to the ambassador, he said finally. You said that what the sovereignty trusts is authenticity. Evidence that you are not performing. Yes. Are you performing now? She considered the question. She considered the last 3 days, the 3 a.m. memo, the 2 drinks at the reception, and the things she'd said without calculating them, the laugh that had come out before she decided to allow it. She considered the fact that she was standing in a cultural exchange hall talking about consciousness and trust with the most powerful individual in 17 star systems, as if it were a normal Tuesday. No, she said, I am not performing. I know, he said. That is why we are having this conversation. The final formal session happened 2 days later. By then, the sovereignty's position had shifted. Sierra tracked it in the micro-behaviors, in Vel's posture, in the way the sovereignty team's communication had visibly relaxed. Something had been decided on their side. She didn't know exactly what, but she could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Calloway opened the session. He spoke without a prepared statement, which was unusual, and what he said was brief and honest. That Earth had learned a great deal from this negotiation, that they had come in thinking they understood the terms and had discovered they understood them less than they thought, and that they were grateful for the friction that had revealed the gap, because finding it now was better than discovering it in consequence later. Vel listened. Then he said, in Vrethian, and Sira noted this, that he chose Vrethian for this statement, that he was addressing her as much as Calloway. The Seventh Dominion has observed that Earth's capacity for self-correction is unusually developed. This is a quality the sovereignty values. Calloway looked at Sira. She translated briefly. He nodded. Vel continued. The Alpha King of the Seventh Dominion wishes to extend the terms of the existing corridor agreement to include 3 additional transit lanes, not previously under discussion, as a signal of long-term investment in this partnership. The room went entirely quiet. 3 additional lanes was not a small thing. 3 additional lanes was the kind of concession that typically required 2 years of preliminary work to even propose. The Earth lawyers would need a week just to map the implications. Sira sat very still and thought about the 18 years of patience behind that sentence, the transmissions read across an interstellar distance. The decision made before there was evidence, the long, careful work of building proof for something already believed. She thought about the man from the waiting hall and the beverage machine, about the 4th symbol from the left on the lower tier. She found him afterward in the same hall where they had talked near the sound installation. He was alone, looking out a window at the city, the bioluminescent lines, the curved towers, the beautiful held breath of it. "Thank you," she said. She meant many things by it. She trusted him to understand which. He turned. "The agreement serves both our interests," he said. "The agreement serves both our interests," she agreed. "The rest of it," she stopped. She was thinking about authenticity, about not performing. She said, "You asked me if I was performing. I wasn't. I'm not now either." He looked at her for a long time. The deep-water eyes, the quality of attention that didn't leave anything out. She had the sense, standing in it, of being entirely seen, not evaluated, not categorized, not run through a framework. Simply seen. "I know," he said again. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." A pause and the small, dry, almost humor again. "It is unusual. Most of what I encounter in diplomatic contexts is constructed. You are," he seemed to consider the word. "You are what you are, at full volume, without apparent concern for strategic outcome." "That sounds like a polite way of saying I have no filter." "It is," he said, "a description of what the sovereignty has been looking for in a human partner for 11 years. She thought about Castle, about the 2 drinks, about saying something true that served no strategic purpose. She thought about every small, unscripted moment in every session, all of them accumulated like evidence, all of them pointing at the same thing. "It's a strange thing to value," she said, "being unguarded. Most political frameworks would call that a vulnerability." "Most political frameworks," he said, "are built by species who learn to survive by being opaque. The Vreth learned to survive by knowing. We are very good at knowing things. We are extremely vulnerable to the species we cannot know." He paused. "What we cannot know, we cannot trust. What we cannot trust, we eventually have to treat as a threat. And humans are the only species I have encountered," he said, "that cannot seem to maintain strategic opacity even when they try." Something in his voice shifted, not softer exactly, but less like stone and more like deep water actually moves. "You dropped a tablet and made a joke about it. You admitted to an interpretation gap that your lawyers had missed and that we would not have flagged until it became a problem. You told my attaché he was attractive in front of." A pause. "In front of you," she finished. "In front of me." She looked at him carefully. She thought about the way the temperature in the room had changed, the way he had held his glass and stopped drinking from it, the expression she hadn't been able to name. "Did that bother you?" she asked. The pause this time was different from all the others. She could feel it calibrating. "It was," he said, and then stopped. And the fact that he stopped was itself information, because she had watched this man for 3 days and he did not stop in the middle of sentences. "It was unexpected," he said finally, "in a way I did not have an immediate framework for." She held that. "Is that a Vrethian way of saying you didn't like it?" "It is a Vrethian way of saying," he said very carefully, "that it produced a response I was not anticipating, and that the response was..." Another pause. "Significant." Sira Voss, cognitive linguist, cultural consultant, the person who used words for things. "You're going to have to be more specific." He looked at her with an expression she recognized now. The same thing that had briefly gotten out at the reception. Something kept somewhere else, that kept finding its way back. "For approximately 40 years, he said, "I have not encountered anything I could not categorize. I have met every species on record. I have read every political framework my civilization has documented. I have been very good at knowing what things are." A pause. "You are the first thing in 40 years that I cannot entirely categorize." "Because I'm human." "Because you are you asterisk," he said. "The species is interesting. The individual is..." He stopped again. This time she let it sit. "The individual is something I have not mapped a term for." She stood in the held breath of the alien city, in the sound of something she could only half hear, and thought about the most powerful force in the universe. About the power to know the truth. About where that power lived, not in technology, not in the military, not in political frameworks built over centuries. In the space between two people where one of them had finally stopped performing and the other had been waiting, for 18 years of patient evaluation, for exactly that. "I'm going to be here for another 4 weeks, she said. "Standard diplomatic posting." "I am aware," he said. "And then I'll be reassigned." "I am aware of that as well." She nodded. She looked out at the city. She thought about ripples, about the backward reach of decisions made before evidence, about the strange nonlinear way that important things seem to arrange themselves around the moments when someone just told the truth. "You know," she said, "for a species famous for precision, you're being remarkably imprecise about several things right now." "I know," he said, and this time the dryness was unmistakable. She laughed again. He watched her, the way he had watched the observation glass, as if seeing through to something. As if the thing he had read in the transmissions 18 years ago was here, finally, in 3 dimensions, telling him he hadn't been wrong to believe in it. 4 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. "That's a long time," she said. "A lot can be established in 4 weeks." "Yes," he said again, "a great deal can." She looked at him. He looked at her. Somewhere in the hall behind them, the sound installation ran through one of its unresolvable frequencies, a note that couldn't quite arrive, that kept circling the place where resolution would be, filling the space with the exquisite pressure of something not yet said. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, because she was a person who used words for things, and there was one more word that needed using. "The beverage machine in my residential wing," she said, without turning. "I still haven't figured out the cold drinks tier." Behind her, after a pause, "Second symbol from the right, top tier." She nodded. She walked out into the bioluminescent city and thought about knowledge and trust, and the vast distances across which both of them, somehow improbably at full volume, without strategic calculation, had managed to become real to each other. In the end, that was what the sovereignty had been looking for. In the end, that was what humanity had and had always had, and could never entirely figure out how to suppress even when it tried. The most powerful force in the known universe. the stubbornly, irreducibly, unperformably human heart.